They gave him nothing but a broken clock and threw him out, laughing as he walked away with what they thought was a worthless joke. For 3 years it never stopped ticking, until the night it finally went silent and he discovered why. Hidden inside its brass casing was a false compartment holding a forged signature, a secret ledger, and a letter from the father who raised him, proving his own family had rewritten his dying wishes to erase him. To my stepson, Daniel Cole. He hesitated. An old mantel clock, currently housed in the study. Silence. Then laughter. Sharp, delighted, cruel. Victoria pressed a hand to her mouth. Marcus didn't bother hiding his grin. A clock, Marcus repeated, savoring it. 26 years, and he leaves you a clock. Daniel said nothing. His face burned, but he kept his spine straight, the way he'd trained himself to do since childhood. Never let them see it land. Belle closed the folder, unable to meet his eyes. That concludes the reading. The room emptied in whispers and stifled giggles, chairs scraping like small, gleeful applause. Daniel remained standing alone beneath the portrait of the man who had raised him and, in death, had made him a joke. He didn't yet know the clock on the study shelf was still ticking, and that it had been ticking deliberately, for a reason no one in that room could imagine. By morning, the estate had already forgotten he belonged to it. A staff member Daniel had known since childhood, Mrs. Halloway, avoided his eyes as she handed him a single canvas bag. Miss Victoria said to have your room cleared by noon, she murmured, and the apology in her voice was the only kindness left in the house. He climbed the stairs one final time. His room, the same one he'd slept in since he was 9 years old, had already been stripped bare. His books were gone. His clothes sat folded in a box by the door, as if his entire life could be reduced to a single afternoon's tidying. In the study, the old clock waited on its shelf, exactly where it had always sat, indifferent to the chaos around it. Its brass casing was dull with age, its face scratched, one hand slightly bent. Daniel wrapped it carefully in an old shirt and placed it in the bag. It was, he realized, the only thing in the house that had never once looked away from him. Downstairs, Victoria stood at the base of the staircase with her arms crossed, watching him descend like a queen dismissing a servant. The ledger's been updated, she said coolly. You're not listed as family anymore. Legally, you never were. Marcus leaned against the doorway, swirling a glass of amber liquor. Try not to break your inheritance on the way out, he said, and laughed at his own joke. Daniel didn't answer. He walked past them, out the front doors, down the long gravel drive lined with hedges he'd trimmed as a boy for an allowance he was never truly owed. Behind him, their laughter carried on the cold air, following him like a shadow he couldn't shake. At the end of the drive, he stopped once, looked back at the house that had never been his, and kept walking, the clock ticking softly against his side with every step. 3 years folded into each other like pages in a book no one else would read. Daniel settled 200 miles from the estate, in a small rented house at the edge of a town where nobody knew the name Whitmore. He worked as a carpenter's apprentice, then a carpenter in his own right, his hands learning a language his old life had never taught him, the honest weight of tools, the satisfaction of something built rather than inherited. He told himself he didn't think about that house anymore. Most days it was almost true. The clock sat on the mantel of his small living room, exactly as it had in the Whitmore study, ticking with the same unhurried patience. He'd meant to sell it more than once. A pawnshop on 5th Street had offered him $30 for the brass casing alone, but each time, his hand had hesitated on the door, and he'd walked back home with it still under his arm. It wasn't sentiment, he told himself. It was something else, something he couldn't name. The clock never seemed to slow, never needed winding the way it should have. He checked the mechanism once, out of curiosity, and found nothing unusual: gears, springs, the ordinary architecture of time. And yet it ticked on, steady as a heartbeat, filling the silence of his small house with a sound that felt less like an object and more like a presence. Some nights, lying awake, he'd listen to it and think of his stepfather, the quiet man who'd raised him without ever once making him feel like an outsider, until the very end. He wondered, sometimes, If Edmund Whitmore had known exactly what kind of joke he was leaving behind. He didn't yet understand that the joke was never on him at all. The clock wasn't a mockery. It was a countdown, and somewhere inside it, time was already running out for someone else. The knock came just past 11. 3 sharp raps that pulled Daniel from a half-sleep on the couch. He wasn't expecting anyone. He rarely was. Through the window, he saw an older man standing on the porch, hat pulled low against the drizzle, a coat too fine for the neighborhood. Something about him felt out of place, like a page torn from a different book. "Mr. Cole?" the man asked when Daniel opened the door. "Daniel Cole? Who's asking?" "My name is Arthur Price. I used to work for your stepfather." He glanced past Daniel, toward the mantel, toward the clock ticking faintly in the dim light. "I was his locksmith, among other things." Daniel's grip tightened on the doorframe. "I don't understand." Price's eyes lingered on the clock a moment too long. "That clock," he said slowly, "was never meant to keep time, Mr. Cole. Edmund had me modify it myself years ago. He made me promise never to speak of it while he was alive." "Modify it how?" The old man's face tightened, some private calculation working behind his eyes. He glanced over his shoulder, out toward the empty street, as though the darkness itself might be listening. "I've said more than I should have already," Price murmured. "Watch the clock, Mr. Cole. When it stops, really stops, you'll understand everything. Until then, trust no one who comes asking about it." "Wait," Daniel stepped forward, but Price was already retreating down the porch steps, disappearing into the rain and the dark beyond the streetlight's reach, swallowed up before Daniel could ask another question. He stood in the doorway for a long time afterward, listening to the clock's steady ticking behind him, no longer just a sound. Now it felt like a warning. Sleep didn't come easily after that. Daniel lay awake replaying Price's words until they blurred into the ticking of the clock, until he could no longer tell which sound was real and which was memory. By morning, he'd made a decision. If no one else would tell him the truth, he would find it himself. He started small public records, old newspaper archives at the town library, anything that might mention Edmund Whitmore in his final year. Most of it was unremarkable. Charity galas, quarterly earnings, a photograph of his stepfather looking thinner than Daniel remembered, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. Then he found the filing. Buried in a county courthouse database was an amendment to Edmund's will, dated barely 3 weeks before his death. The language was dense, lawyerly, deliberately difficult, but one detail stood out clearly enough. The amendment had been drafted not by Harold Bell, the family's longtime attorney, but by a different firm entirely, one Daniel had never heard of, operating out of a small office 2 counties away. He drove there the following week and found the office locked, the windows papered over, a forwarding notice taped crookedly to the glass. The attorney of record, a man named Simon Vale, had closed his practice and left the country less than a month after Edmund's funeral. No explanation, no trail. Daniel sat in his truck outside the empty office for a long time, the implications settling over him slowly, like weight pressing down through his chest. Someone had changed the will at the very end of Edmund's life. Someone had made sure the lawyer who drafted that change was gone before anyone could ask him a single question. And someone, Daniel was now certain, had wanted him far away from the estate before he could notice any of it. He thought of the clock waiting on his mantel, still ticking, still keeping whatever secret it had been built to hold. Price's warning echoed back to him. Trust no one who comes asking about it. He was beginning to understand why. Word travels faster among the wealthy than anywhere else, carried not by gossip but by the quiet machinery of lawyers, accountants, and old friends who owe old favors. It took less than 2 weeks for Victoria to learn her stepbrother had been asking questions. The first sign was a phone call, her voice honeyed in a way Daniel hadn't heard since childhood, back when kindness from her had always come with a price attached. "Daniel," she said, as though they spoke often, as though 3 years of silence hadn't passed between them. "I heard you've been looking into things. Father's estate. I just want to make sure you're doing all right. It must be hard, being on your own out there." "I'm fine," he said carefully. Good, good. A pause, deliberate and cold beneath its warmth. You know, digging up the past rarely helps anyone, Daniel. Father's affairs were complicated. Messy even. I'd hate for you to get tangled in something that isn't really your concern anymore. The line went quiet before he could respond, and the call ended. 2 days later, a different kind of message arrived. An envelope with no return address, left directly on his porch rather than in the mailbox. Inside was a single photograph of himself, taken outside the shuttered lawyer's office in the neighboring county, along with a typed note. Asterisk, some doors are closed for a reason. Walk away, Daniel. This is your only warning. Asterisk. His hands trembled slightly as he read it a second time, then a third. Whoever this was, they weren't guessing. They'd been watching him closely enough to know exactly where he'd gone, exactly what he'd found. This was no longer about a battered old clock or a joke made at a funeral. Someone had rewritten a dying man's final wishes and gone to considerable lengths to erase the evidence, which meant there was a great deal of money, and something far darker, riding on Daniel never uncovering the truth. He looked at the clock on his mantel, its ticking suddenly louder in the silence of the room. Whatever it was hiding, someone was willing to make him disappear to keep it buried. Weeks passed in a kind of watchful stillness. Daniel told no one else what he'd found, kept his questions folded quietly inside him, and waited, though for what, he couldn't have said. It happened on an unremarkable Tuesday night, the kind that left no mark on the calendar. He was sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee cooling beside him, when he noticed it. Silence. Not the ordinary quiet of a late evening, but something deeper, something missing. It took him a moment to place it, the absence beneath the hum of the refrigerator, beneath the wind outside the window. The clock had stopped. He rose slowly, almost afraid to approach it, as though sudden movement might undo whatever had just happened. For 3 years, that ticking had been the one constant in his life, so steady he'd stopped consciously hearing it at all. Now its absence rang louder than the sound ever had. He stood before the mantel and stared at the still hands, frozen at 17 minutes past 9, exactly as Price had told him they would be. When it stops, really stops, you'll understand everything. His pulse quickened. This wasn't a mechanism running down from age or neglect. He'd wounded himself only 2 days earlier, out of habit more than necessity, and it had never faltered before. This felt deliberate, timed, as if it had been built to hold its secret for exactly this long, and not a moment longer. Daniel lifted the clock carefully from the mantel, turning it over in his hands, feeling its familiar weight settle differently now. Heavier, somehow, with meaning. Whatever Edmund Whitmore had hidden inside this old brass casing, the wait was finally over. It was time to look. He carried the clock to the kitchen table and set it down gently, the way one might handle something alive. His hands hovered over the back panel, a small brass plate held by 4 aged screws, worn smooth from decades of winding and polishing. He found a screwdriver in the junk drawer and worked slowly, deliberately, aware somehow that this moment deserved patience rather than haste. The first screw came loose with a faint groan of old metal. Then the second, the third, the fourth. The panel lifted away. Inside, the clock's ordinary gears and springs sat exactly where they should, undisturbed, innocent, except for a section toward the base that didn't belong. A thin wooden partition, cut with careful precision, hid a shallow compartment behind the visible machinery. Daniel's breath caught as he realized what he was looking at. Price hadn't lied. The clock had never simply kept time. It had been built or rebuilt to keep a secret. He pried the partition loose with trembling fingers. Inside, folded tightly to fit the narrow space, was a thick stack of papers, brittle at the edges, along with a small brass key, tarnished with age, and a single envelope with his name written across it in handwriting he recognized instantly. Edmonds. His throat tightened. He hadn't seen that handwriting in years. The particular slant of the E, the way his stepfather always crossed his sevens in the European style, he'd never fully unlearned. Daniel set the papers aside for a moment, unable to look at them yet, and opened the envelope first. Inside was a single sheet, the ink slightly faded. Asterisk, Daniel, if you are reading this, Then the clock has done exactly what I built it to do, and you have proven exactly what I always believed about you. I could not protect you while I lived. I have tried to protect you after. Trust nothing you were told about my death. Trust only what is in your hands now. Asterisk. Below the words, his stepfather's familiar signature, steady despite everything. Daniel sat in the silence of his kitchen for a long moment, the papers heavy in his lap, understanding, finally, that he had never been forgotten at all. He had been chosen. With unsteady hands, Daniel unfolded the papers he'd found beneath the clock's false floor, spreading them carefully across the kitchen table like pieces of a puzzle he was only now permitted to solve. The first document was a will, but not the one Harold Bell had read aloud in that crowded, mocking room. This version was dated only 4 months before Edmund's death, properly witnessed, properly notarized, the language unmistakably clear in a way the courtroom filing never had been. To my son, Daniel Cole, I leave the whole of the Whitmore estate, its holdings, and its name, in recognition of a loyalty and character that cannot be purchased or inherited by blood alone. Daniel read the line 3 times before it settled into something he could believe. Beneath it sat a second set of documents. Bank statements, correspondence, a handwritten ledger in Edmund's careful script tracking dates and names Daniel didn't yet recognize. One name repeated throughout: Simon Vale, the vanished attorney. Payments to his firm had begun weeks before Edmund's death and continued for several months after. Long after Vale should have had any further business with a dead man's estate. The final page made his stomach turn cold. It was a comparison, prepared by Edmund himself in his final weeks, of 2 signatures side by side. His own authentic signature, and a second one from the official will, subtly, almost invisibly different. A forgery skilled enough to fool a courtroom, but not the man whose signature it had stolen. Edmund had known. Somehow, in those final months, he had discovered someone close to him intended to rewrite his wishes after he was gone. And rather than confront it directly and risk it happening sooner, he had built a hidden trail only Daniel would ever find, sealed inside the one object no one would think twice about stealing. A joke, everyone had called it. A humiliation. It had been the safest hiding place in the world. Daniel sat back, the full shape of it settling over him. Someone inside that family, someone who had stood in that room and laughed at him, had forged a dying man's final wishes. And they had done it to make absolutely certain Daniel Cole inherited nothing at all. He should have known the silence wouldn't last. 2 days after he'd read Edmund's letter, a car he didn't recognize idled outside his house for the better part of an hour before finally pulling away. The following morning, his carpentry shop received a call from a man claiming to be a county inspector, asking oddly specific questions about Daniel's schedule, his hours, when he was typically alone. By the 3rd day, the warnings had stopped being subtle. A man in an expensive coat appeared at his door that evening, flanked by another who said nothing at all. Daniel recognized neither of them, but he recognized the type, the kind of men wealth hired when it needed something handled quietly. "Mr. Cole," the first man said pleasantly, though his eyes held no warmth at all. "Victoria Whitmore sends her regards. She understands you may have come into possession of certain family documents. She'd like them returned. Immediately." "I don't know what you're talking about," Daniel said, keeping his voice steady though his pulse hammered. The man's smile thinned. "Let's not waste each other's time. We know about the clock. We know it's no longer at this address." His eyes flicked past Daniel into the house, cataloging. "Whatever you think you found, I'd encourage you to consider your safety before you consider your inheritance." The silent man beside him shifted his weight, deliberate, unmistakably a threat dressed as posture. Daniel forced himself not to look toward the hall closet, where he'd hidden the documents and the key inside an old toolbox only hours earlier. A small, instinctive precaution that now felt like the only thing standing between him and disaster. "I'll consider it," Daniel said carefully, and shut the door before either man could respond. He stood with his back against it for a long moment, heart pounding, listening until he heard their car finally pull away down the street. They knew. Somehow they already knew what he'd found, which meant Price, or someone else close to the truth, was no longer safe either. Whatever evidence he had, it wouldn't stay hidden much longer. Not with people willing to come to his door. Daniel had run out of time to be careful. Tomorrow, he would go back to the one place he'd sworn he would never return to, the Whitmore estate. The gates of the Whitmore estate looked smaller than he remembered. Though his hands still trembled as he passed through them, the folder of documents pressed tightly beneath his arm. He'd called ahead, not to warn them, but to ensure they would all be gathered in one room, unable to scatter or deny. Harold Bell had arranged it reluctantly, his voice uncertain on the phone, sensing that whatever was coming would upend everything he thought he understood about his old client's final wishes. The study looked exactly as it had the day of the funeral. Victoria sat rigid in the same chair, Marcus beside her, both dressed as though wealth alone could shield them from whatever Daniel had come to say. Harold Bell stood near the desk, visibly uneasy. "This had better be worth interrupting my afternoon," Victoria said coolly, though her eyes flicked toward the folder in his hands with poorly hidden unease. Daniel didn't sit. He set the folder on the desk and opened it slowly, letting the silence stretch before he spoke. "Edmund left a second will," he said. "The real one, notarized 4 months before he died, naming me primary heir to the entire estate." Marcus scoffed, but the sound came out thinner than he intended. "That's absurd. Fabricated. You expect us to believe." "I expect you to look at the signatures," Daniel said, laying the comparison page across the desk. Edmund's own careful analysis in plain view. "Your father noticed the forgery on the official will himself, before he died. He compared it against genuine documents and wrote down exactly what he found." Bell leaned forward, examining the page, his face draining of color as recognition set in. "And the payments," Daniel continued, laying down the bank records, "to Simon Vale, beginning weeks before Edmund's death, continuing well after, for a will that was supposedly finalized long before any of this began." The room had gone utterly silent. Victoria's composure cracked for the first time Daniel had ever witnessed, a flicker of panic breaking through the ice. "You paid him," Daniel said quietly, watching her face confirm what the documents already proved. "You had the will rewritten after your father died, and you made sure the lawyer who did it disappeared before anyone could ask him a single question." Marcus stared at his sister, the color draining from his own face as the truth settled between them. Betrayal discovering itself in real time. Victoria said nothing at all. The weeks that followed moved with a strange, clinical speed, as though the truth, once spoken aloud, refused to wait any longer for its consequences. Harold Bell, shaken but resolute, submitted the second will and its supporting evidence to the estate court himself, unwilling to let his own oversight compound the fraud any further. Forensic analysts confirmed what Edmund had already suspected in his final months. The signature on the official will was a careful, deliberate forgery, and the timeline of payments to Simon Vale left little room for doubt about who had commissioned it. Victoria's composure did not survive the investigation. Financial records, phone logs, and Vale's own hurried, incriminating correspondence, recovered from an offshore account he'd foolishly continued using, painted a picture the courts could not ignore. She had orchestrated the forgery within days of her father's death, banking on Daniel's absence from the family to ensure no one would ever question it. The court moved to invalidate the fraudulent will entirely. Every holding, every property, every share Victoria and Marcus believed secured, was reassigned according to Edmund's true and final wishes. Marcus, who claimed ignorance of his sister's scheme, retained a modest settlement, enough to survive, not enough to rebuild what he'd lost. The house that had once cast him out now belonged to him entirely. Not as revenge, he realized, standing in the quiet of the room his stepfather had loved most, but as the fulfillment of a promise made long before anyone believed he deserved one. Months later, once the courts had settled and the estate had quieted into something resembling peace, Daniel found himself in the study late one evening, the old clock resting on the desk before him, its hands still frozen at 17 minutes past 9. He thought often now of that afternoon at the funeral, the laughter, the humiliation, the weight of standing alone beneath his stepfather's portrait while his siblings mocked the only inheritance he'd been given. He understood now what none of them had been capable of seeing. Edmund hadn't left him a joke. He had left him a shield. In those final months, Sensing betrayal closing in around him but unable to prove it while he still lived, Edmund had built the one hiding place his enemies would never think to search, an object so worthless in their eyes that no one would look at it twice, let alone take it apart. He had entrusted Daniel with something he couldn't entrust to lawyers, to bank vaults, to anyone close enough to the family to be reached. He had entrusted it to the one person he trusted completely. Daniel ran his fingers along the clock's dulled brass casing, feeling the same steady weight he'd carried out of this house 3 years earlier, except now it felt entirely different. Not a burden, not a mockery, a message, patiently ticking through years of exile and silence, waiting only for the moment Daniel was ready to hear it. I could not protect you while I lived. I have tried to protect you after. He understood now why the clock had never stopped, why it had ticked on through every lonely night in that small rented house, through every doubt he'd carried about his place in the world. Edmund had given him time, not to wait, but to become exactly the kind of man who would eventually deserve what waited inside. He closed his hand gently around the still, silent clock, and for the first time in years, felt something settle fully into peace. Autumn settled over the Whitmore estate the way it always had, gold light falling through the tall study windows, the grounds quiet in a way that no longer felt like exile. Daniel had changed little about the house since reclaiming it. The portraits remained, the old furniture, the long gravel drive where he'd once walked away certain he'd never return. He'd kept Mrs. Halloway on, given her a place of genuine respect rather than quiet servitude, and slowly, carefully, begun rebuilding what his stepfather had spent a lifetime creating. But of everything within those walls, the clock remained the only object he refused to let anyone touch. It sat now on the same study shelf where it had waited patiently for 26 years before Edmund ever placed it in his hands. Its face still frozen at 17 minutes past 9, its ticking silenced forever the night it had finally done its job. He'd had the false compartment sealed once more, empty now, its purpose fulfilled, not out of secrecy, but reverence, the way one preserves the shape of a promise long after it has been kept. Sometimes, in the evenings, he would sit across from it with a cup of coffee, remembering the laughter in that room the day the will was read, remembering how thoroughly he had believed, for a moment, that he had been given nothing at all. He understood now that inheritance was never only about money, or land, or a name restored to a ledger. It was about being seen, fully and completely, by someone who refused to let the world's judgment become the final word. Edmund Whitmore had not left him a clock. He had left him proof that he had always, quietly, unmistakably belonged, and that some kinds of love keep ticking long after the world insists they've gone silent.